New Year's Eve is a time of celebration, a moment when families gather, glasses are raised, and the promise of a better tomorrow seems just within reach. In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Johnson family joined in the festivities like millions of others. They counted down the seconds, cheered as the clock struck midnight, and shared a toast to the future. But the stillness that followed the fireworks carried an unexpected weight. The air in their home seemed colder than it should have been, though the heater hummed steadily. Somewhere in the distance, faint sounds echoed, a noise so subtle it could almost be ignored. Almost. It was a tapping, faint at first, as though fingers were brushing against glass. James dismissed it, laughing it off as branches swaying in the winter wind. Sarah hesitated, but said nothing, focusing instead on gathering the scattered glasses and plates. Emma, their 8-year-old daughter, had already fallen asleep on the couch, blissfully unaware of the growing unease her parents didn't dare voice. The house, built decades before, had its quirks. Old pipes that groaned in the night, floorboards that creaked without warning. But tonight, it felt different. The sound moved from the kitchen window to the sliding door at the back. Then it stopped entirely. A quiet settled over the house, thick and heavy. James carried Emma to bed, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. He whispered goodnight, his words almost swallowed by the silence. Downstairs, Sarah turned off the lights and locked the doors, double-checking each one before retreating to their room. They should have felt safe. They had locked the doors, checked the windows, turned on the alarm. But when the clock read 2:17 a.m., James woke with a start. He wasn't sure what had roused him at first. Perhaps a sound, perhaps something more subtle. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the digital clock on the nightstand. He sat up, listening. The house was still, too still. Then he noticed the door to their bedroom, wide open. James knew they had closed it before falling asleep. He was sure of it. The air in the hallway felt colder as he stepped outside, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. What he found at the top of the stairs would stay with him forever. A single muddy footprint leading from the front door to the bottom step, then fading into nothingness. The door was locked. The alarm was set. No one could have gotten in, or so they thought. The Johnson family had only recently moved into the house, nestled at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac. It was everything they had hoped for. Spacious, with a large backyard where Emma could play, and a charming front porch that seemed to belong to a postcard. They were eager to start fresh, away from the noise of the city, away from the rush of everyday life. It was a place where they could finally breathe, finally settle. The house itself had stood for over a century, weathered but beautiful, with an old-world charm that had drawn Sarah in the moment they pulled into the driveway. James had been more skeptical. He always was. He noticed the cracks in the foundation, the draft that whispered through the windows, and the subtle groan of the floorboards beneath his feet. But Sarah loved it, and Emma too had been enchanted by the grand staircase and the attic that promised endless adventures. So James relented, telling himself that no house was perfect, that a little work would make it their own. The neighbors were kind, though distant. They had welcomed the Johnsons with polite smiles and small talk, but offered little beyond that. There were no casseroles, no invitations to coffee, no long conversations at the mailbox. Instead, there was a lingering hesitance in their eyes, as if they knew something they weren't saying. James noticed it first when the man across the street, A retiree named Carl had paused mid-sentence while discussing the local schools. He had looked at the house, then at James, and said almost apologetically, "It's a great place for families. You'll get used to it." Sarah brushed it off. She was used to small-town quirks and figured the neighbors simply needed time. But as the days turned into weeks, a pattern began to emerge. Every mention of the house was followed by an odd silence, a quick change of subject, or an uneasy glance. And then there were the small things. The mail was occasionally delivered to the wrong address. Packages went missing. Contractors they had hired to fix the gutters canceled without explanation. It was frustrating, but not enough to raise alarms, at least not then. The house had its own peculiarities, as old houses often do. Emma had taken to speaking about an imaginary friend named Anna, who she claimed lived in the attic. It was harmless, Sarah thought, even sweet. Emma had always been creative, and imaginary friends weren't unusual for children her age. But James felt uneasy about it, especially when Emma began refusing to go into the attic alone. "Anna doesn't like it when you're up there without her," she would say. And then there was the noise, the faint tapping at night, the occasional creak of footsteps on the stairs when no one was there. Still, life went on. They decorated for the holidays, hosted Emma's birthday party, and tried to ignore the strange occurrences that seemed to come and go without explanation. But as New Year's Eve approached, the atmosphere in the house began to shift. It was subtle at first, a door that wouldn't stay closed, a cold spot in the hallway, the feeling of being watched when no one else was in the room. They told themselves it was nothing. Houses settle, pipes groan, shadows play tricks on the eyes. They believed it until they couldn't. It started with the lights. A faint flicker in the living room, barely noticeable at first. James tightened the bulbs and checked the breaker box, chalking it up to old wiring. But the flickers persisted, spreading to the kitchen, the hallway, and finally the upstairs bedrooms. Then came the noises, soft thuds, faint enough to make you second-guess if you'd heard them at all. Sarah insisted it was just the house settling, but the sounds grew louder, more distinct. It was always at night, always when the house was supposed to be still. Emma was the first to mention something strange. One evening, as Sarah tucked her into bed, Emma pointed to the corner of her room and whispered, "Anna doesn't like it when you leave the light on." Sarah froze, her fingers hovering over the lamp switch. She looked at the empty corner, her heart pounding. "Who's Anna?" she asked, forcing a smile. Emma giggled. "You know, Anna. She's been here longer than we have." Sarah didn't press further, telling herself it was just the imagination of an 8-year-old. But that night, the tapping began again, this time louder, coming from the attic. James dismissed it as a raccoon or a squirrel, something harmless. Armed with a flashlight, he climbed the rickety ladder to the attic and swung open the door. The beam of light swept across dusty boxes, cobwebbed corners, and a single rocking chair in the middle of the room. The chair creaked as though it had just been disturbed, but the attic was empty. James checked every corner, finding nothing but old junk left behind by the previous owners. He shut the door tightly, convinced he'd scared off whatever animal had caused the noise. But the tapping didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more deliberate, as if demanding to be heard. Meanwhile, Sarah began noticing things out of place. Her keys would vanish from the counter only to reappear in the hallway. Picture frames on the mantel tilted, though no one had touched them. The radio in the kitchen would turn on by itself, always to the same station, a station that hadn't broadcast in years. And then there was Emma. She stopped playing outside and spent more and more time in her room, talking to Anna. Her once bright demeanor became subdued, almost withdrawn. When Sarah asked her what was wrong, Emma would only reply, "Anna doesn't like it when you ask questions." One night, James woke up to find Sarah sitting upright in bed, staring at the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer at first, her gaze fixed on something in the hallway. Finally, she said, "I saw someone standing there. A woman." James leapt out of bed and turned on every light in the house, searching room by room. But there was no one. The doors were locked, the windows shut. Still, Sarah insisted she had seen her, a figure in a long dress, standing just outside their bedroom watching. The next day, James decided to install cameras. He set them up in the living room, the kitchen, and the upstairs hallway, determined to catch whatever or whoever was causing the disturbances. For 2 nights, the footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. But on the 3rd night, as the family slept, the hallway camera picked up movement. A shadow, tall and thin, slid across the wall, stopping just outside Emma's room. The door creaked open slowly, but the shadow didn't enter. It simply hovered there, motionless, before fading into the darkness. When James reviewed the footage the next morning, his hands trembled as he pressed pause. The timestamp read 3 a.m. Every hair on his body stood on end. Still, he didn't tell Sarah. He didn't want to scare her. Instead, he told himself it was a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Something was in their house, and it wasn't going to leave on its own. One evening, as James locked up for the night, he noticed the attic door was slightly ajar. He was certain he had locked it after the last inspection. Taking a deep breath, he climbed the ladder again. But this time, something was different. The rocking chair in the middle of the attic wasn't empty. On it sat Emma's favorite doll, its head turned to face the door, its glassy eyes catching the beam of James's flashlight. James felt his stomach drop. "Sarah," he called out, his voice trembling. But before she could answer, the attic door slammed shut behind him. What James found in the attic that night would change everything, but more on that in a moment. A week later, Sarah was cleaning Emma's room when she found a series of crumpled papers stuffed under the bed. Curious, she smoothed them out, revealing childlike drawings. At first glance, they seemed innocent. Emma, Sarah, James, and their house. But in each picture, there was something else. A figure, tall and shadowy, standing in the background, its face blank. In the last drawing, the figure wasn't in the background. It was standing next to Emma, its hand on her shoulder. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "Emma, who is this?" she asked, holding up the drawing. Emma didn't look up from her toys. "That's Anna," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Sarah tried to dismiss it as a figment of Emma's imagination. But what happened that night would make her question everything she thought she knew. The tapping sounds grew louder and more persistent, but now they weren't coming from the attic. They were coming from below, from the basement. James grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under his weight. The air grew colder with each step, and the faint smell of earth and decay filled his nostrils. At the bottom of the stairs, he found an old wooden door he had never noticed before. It was partially obscured by shelves and boxes, as though someone had tried to hide it. Taking a deep breath, James pushed the door open. What he found behind that door would haunt him forever. But let's step back to understand how the house's history might explain what he saw. It was just past midnight when Sarah woke to the sound of Emma's voice. At first, she thought Emma was talking in her sleep. But the longer she listened, the clearer it became. Emma was having a conversation. Sarah crept down the hallway, her footsteps muffled by the carpet. She stopped just outside Emma's door, pressing her ear to the wood. "I told them you don't like it," Emma whispered. There was a pause, as if she were listening to someone respond. Then Emma giggled. "Okay, I'll tell her," she said. Sarah's heart pounded as she pushed the door open. Emma sat cross-legged on the bed, her eyes wide as she stared at the corner of the room. Sarah followed her gaze but saw nothing. "Who are you talking to?" Sarah asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Emma turned to her, smiling. "Anna says she likes you," she said, "but she doesn't like Daddy." Sarah's unease grew, but it wasn't until she reviewed the footage from the hallway camera that she realized how serious the situation had become. On New Year's Eve, as the clock ticked toward midnight, the Johnsons tried to go about their celebrations as usual. They toasted with champagne, watched the fireworks, and laughed nervously at the strange happenings of the past month. But at exactly 12:01 a.m., the power went out. The house was plunged into darkness, save for the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. The tapping returned, louder than ever, echoing through the house like a heartbeat. And then, without warning, Emma began to scream. What happened in the moments that followed would push the Johnson family to their breaking point. We'll reveal the truth after this. Emma's screams echoed through the darkened house, piercing and raw. James and Sarah bolted from their seats, tripping over furniture as they rushed to her room. When they flung the door open, they found Emma standing in the center of the room, her eyes wide and unfocused, her face wet with tears. She wasn't screaming anymore, she was pointing. James followed her trembling finger to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed unnaturally thick, shifting and undulating as though they were alive. "Emma, what is it?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. Emma didn't answer. Instead, she turned to her parents and said in a voice that wasn't her own, "She's here." Before James could react, the lights flickered back on, and the shadows in the corner dissipated. The room was silent again, except for Emma's soft sobs. Sarah scooped her up, holding her tightly, while James searched the room, opening the closet, checking under the bed. But there was nothing there, nothing they could see. Determined to put an end to the madness, James returned to the basement. He had to know what was behind the mysterious door he had found days earlier. Armed with a crowbar and flashlight, he pried the door open, revealing a narrow stone staircase spiraling down into the earth. The air was damp and cold, carrying the faint smell of rot. With every step, James's unease grew. At the bottom of the staircase, he found a small, windowless room filled with strange symbols carved into the walls. In the center of the room was an old wooden chest, its lid slightly ajar. James hesitated, his hand hovering over the lid. He told himself it was just an old storage box, that the fear knotting in his stomach was irrational. But when he opened it, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Inside were personal items, letters, photographs, locks of hair, all belonging to the previous owners of the house. At the bottom of the chest was a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. James flipped through its pages, each one filled with frantic, scrawled entries about a presence in the house, a watcher who could not be escaped. The final entry read, "It doesn't matter where you go, she follows." Upstairs, Sarah was putting Emma back to bed when the bedroom door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The lights flickered again, and the air grew icy. Emma clung to her mother, crying as a low guttural sound filled the room. Sarah pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room. "James!" she screamed, her voice breaking. But James was still in the basement, frozen in place, staring at the final page of the journal. It wasn't until he heard Sarah's screams that he snapped out of his trance and bolted up the stairs. When James reached the bedroom, the sight stopped him cold. The walls were covered in words, written in what looked like soot or ash. "Get out!" They were repeated over and over, covering every inch of the room. Emma was trembling in Sarah's arms, her face buried in her mother's shoulder. "We're leaving," James said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. Sarah didn't hesitate. They grabbed what they could and left the house that night, the taillights of their car disappearing into the darkness. But as they drove away, Emma looked out the rear window and whispered, "She's following us." Neither James nor Sarah responded, but their faces betrayed their fear. They didn't look back. They didn't dare. The Johnsons didn't stop driving until the sun began to rise. Exhausted and shaken, they checked into a small motel on the outskirts of town. The room was cramped, the wallpaper peeling, but it was a refuge, a place to catch their breath. James collapsed onto the bed, his head in his hands, while Sarah held Emma tightly, brushing back her hair and whispering that everything would be okay. But deep down, neither of them believed it. That morning, James made a call to the previous owners of the house. The woman who answered hesitated when he mentioned the address. "We don't talk about that place," she said, her voice clipped and tense. But when James pressed her, she finally relented. "It's not just the house," she said. "It's her. She doesn't stay in one place. She attaches." James's blood ran cold. "Who is she?" he demanded, but the line went dead. That night at the motel, as the family tried to rest, Sarah awoke to the sound of Emma laughing. At first, she thought Emma was dreaming, but when she turned on the bedside lamp, she saw Emma sitting upright, her eyes wide open, staring at the corner of the room. "Hannah's here," she said softly. Sarah's heart sank as she realized the truth. They hadn't escaped. They couldn't escape. Over the next few weeks, the Johnsons moved from place to place, hoping that distance would sever the connection. But no matter where they went, the signs persisted. The tapping, the cold spots, the feeling of being watched. It was always there, a shadow lurking at the edge of their lives. Emma grew quieter, more withdrawn, her once vivid personality replaced by a vacant stare. James and Sarah fought constantly, their nerves frayed by fear and exhaustion. The family was unraveling, and they knew it. The last known sighting of the Johnsons was at a gas station in a remote town 2 states over. The clerk remembered them well. James looked disheveled, Sarah seemed on edge, and Emma was standing by the door, talking to someone the clerk couldn't see. They left without a word, and their car was later found abandoned on a desolate stretch of highway. Inside were their belongings, hastily packed, and Emma's drawings scattered across the back seat. The final picture showed the 3 of them, hand in hand, with a tall, shadowy figure standing behind them. No one knows what happened to the Johnsons after that night, but the house remains, its windows dark, its walls silent. Occasionally, a new family moves in, drawn by the charm of the old Victorian. They stay for a while, then leave just as quickly, whispering about noises, shadows, and cold spots. The neighbors don't ask questions, they already know, because it's never just the house, and it's never truly over. The Johnson story serves as a chilling reminder. Not every new year brings hope and renewal. Sometimes the past refuses to stay behind, and sometimes it follows. The house still stands waiting for its next occupants. The question is, would you dare step inside? Or worse, what if something like this isn't bound to a place, but to people? Could it happen to you? If you thought this story was unsettling, wait until you hear about the asylum where visitors report seeing shadows that mimic their every move, and not everyone makes it back out. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next chilling tale. And remember, leave a comment below. What would you do if you were in the Johnsons' shoes? Would you run? Or would you stay and face the unknown?